At 3:47 this morning Eastern Time, deep inside a protected conference room in the Pentagon's E-Ring Command Center, an event took place that has never happened during the entire 248-year tradition of civilian authority over the U.S. military. 4 active-duty 4-star generals who lead 3 of the nation's unified combatant commands conducted what people with knowledge of the situation are describing as an urgent coordination call. According to 2 individuals who were directly informed about the discussion and 1 high-ranking defense official who examined the classified after-action report, the generals openly talked about their constitutional responsibility to reject specific types of directives coming from the White House. This is not an exercise. This is not partisan drama. This is the point at which the senior American military leadership structure begins to crack under instructions that top officers consider crossing the boundary from divisive policy into outright unlawful commands. I need you to grasp how serious this is. What occurred in that room at 3:47 a.m. isn't merely a defense story or a courtroom story. It is a severe test of whether the constitutional system of checks and balances can still operate when an occupant of the Oval Office acts as though those checks simply don't apply to him. If you care about the survival of the institutions that have kept this country stable for almost 2.5 centuries, you should subscribe to this channel immediately and enable notifications, because the decisions made in the next 72 hours will reveal whether the U.S. military continues to answer to civilian authority or whether we are watching the early stages of a constitutional breakdown that will mark this era. Here is what has been confirmed. I want to be completely transparent about the sourcing because what follows is not guesswork. 3 separate sources, 2 senior defense officials briefed on the call shortly after it ended, and 1 congressional staff member on the Senate Armed Services Committee who received a classified summary this morning have verified the core content of the conversation. According to the official readout sent through secure systems at 6:14 a.m. today, the 4 generals participating were the commanders of U.S. Northern Command, U.S. Southern Command, U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, and U.S. Strategic Command. These are not mid-level officers. These are 4-star generals responsible for defending the homeland, overseeing operations across Latin America, maintaining readiness in the Pacific, and safeguarding the country's nuclear forces. The discussion lasted 47 minutes. 1 person who read the summary of the transcript reported that the word unconstitutional was used 6 times, illegal order appeared 4 times, and impeachment liability came up twice. These were not offhand remarks about policy differences. This was the highest level of military command seriously examining the legal limits of their duty to carry out presidential instructions. The triggering event, based on people familiar with the sequence, happened at 11:23 p.m. last night when a National Security Council memorandum was sent through secure channels to every unified combatant command. Sources characterize the document as a presidential order carrying immediate execution deadlines. 3 independent experts in constitutional law, each consulted separately, described elements of the directive as potentially unlawful orders concerning the use of active duty forces for domestic law enforcement activities in areas where state governors had not asked for federal help. Professor David Harmon, a constitutional law scholar at Georgetown, who has counseled both Republican and Democratic administrations on war powers issues, reviewed the outline of the order on background and said that, if the description holds, it would constitute a clear breach of the Posse Comitatus Act, the 1878 law that has long defined the limits of military involvement in domestic policing. Retired Colonel Sarah Chen, a former federal prosecutor and military justice specialist now teaching at West Point, told associates in a private message obtained by this channel that officers receiving such instructions would confront the hardest choice of their professional lives: follow the chain of command or honor their oath to protect the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Let me explain step by step how events reached this point, because this did not appear suddenly. It is the result of 3 weeks of steadily rising friction between the White House and Pentagon leadership. Every stage witnessed and recorded by people who recognized they were seeing history unfold in real time. January 8th, 2026, the president delivers a televised Oval Office speech declaring what he calls a national security emergency that demands urgent federal action in 3 cities facing high crime levels: Portland, Chicago, and Philadelphia. In the address, he mentions deploying active duty military units as an enforcement tool, asserting that local officials have shown themselves either unable or unwilling to keep order. Within 90 minutes, Joint Chiefs Chairman General Marcus Caldwell releases an extremely rare public statement clarifying that no deployment instructions have come through official military channels and that any such orders would need thorough legal examination before being carried out. This is highly unusual. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs almost never publicly corrects a presidential speech unless communication between civilian and military leadership has broken down catastrophically. January 11th. At 6:47 a.m., the president posts on social media directly criticizing General Caldwell by name, labeling him a timid bureaucrat more concerned with safeguarding his own image than protecting American cities. The message includes the line, "Maybe it's time for new leadership at the Pentagon." Within hours, 3 former Joint Chiefs chairmen, representing both parties, release a joint public statement supporting Caldwell and stressing that military officers swear their oath to the Constitution, not to any single person in office. This goes far beyond typical Washington friction. Retired 4-star officers are openly standing behind an active duty chairman against presidential attack, sending a clear signal to current leaders that the institution will back them if they face untenable situations. January 14th. The Secretary of Defense, described by sources as increasingly sidelined in White House decision-making, holds what attendees called a strained video conference with all unified combatant commanders. 2 participants said the secretary directly reminded everyone of their duty to reject unlawful orders, pointing to the post-World War II Nuremberg principles that forbid military personnel from excusing illegal conduct by saying they were simply obeying superiors. One person present called the mood somber, with commanders realizing they were being given guidance for handling a potential constitutional emergency. But here is the part almost no one is talking about, and it is deeply troubling. On January 16th, only 5 days ago, the White House quietly transferred 3 senior Pentagon career officials who specialized in military law and operational planning. These were not political figures rotating between administrations. They were long-serving institutional experts. Their removal created what one ex-defense official described as a complete legal review gap at the exact moment such review is most essential. The moves were handled through personnel decisions that bypassed Senate confirmation, so they occurred without congressional visibility or public announcement. Sources close to the action say the 3 were replaced by people whose main credential seems to be personal allegiance to the president rather than deep knowledge of military justice or constitutional principles. This is not standard staffing. This is deliberate dismantling of the internal safeguards designed precisely to stop unlawful orders from reaching field commands. Now, the situation turns genuinely hazardous. On January 18th, 3 days ago, the president conducted an off-the-record session at Mar-a-Lago with a small circle of political advisors and one newly installed Pentagon liaison whose total military background amounts to less than 2 years in a non-combat support position. A person informed about the discussion said the president voiced irritation with what he saw as military obstruction of lawful directives and explored ways to remove senior officers he believes are conducting what he termed a quiet coup against his authority. The discussion repeatedly referenced Eisenhower had to fire MacArthur, invoking President Truman's 1951 dismissal of General Douglas MacArthur during the Korean War. Although sources noted the president mixed up Truman and Eisenhower, and the historical comparison does not fit because MacArthur was openly insubordinate rather than refusing to carry out orders. That brings us to last night at 11:23 p.m. when the directive went out, and what followed is what sparked the 3:47 a.m. call that marks the most severe rupture between civilian and military leadership in contemporary U.S. history. People who have seen the directive say it includes precise deployment instructions with execution windows counted in hours rather than days. The orders instructed commanders to ready active duty units for immediate movement to perform what the document called order maintenance operations in urban zones where local law enforcement supposedly requested support. Here is the decisive fact that 3 sources stressed. When Pentagon legal personnel tried to confirm those requests by contacting state governors and local authorities, they learned no such requests existed. Not only had the governors of Oregon, Illinois, and Pennsylvania never asked for federal military help, but when reached through informal channels for clarification, all three governors stated plainly they had not been consulted and would not approve federal military activity inside their states. This is the moment when constitutional structure directly confronts a presidential order. The Posse Comitatus Act of 1878, strengthened by later statutes including the Insurrection Act, makes clear that federal military forces may not perform domestic law enforcement duties except under very limited conditions. The president may invoke the Insurrection Act during rebellion or when state leaders cannot preserve order and formally request aid. But every legal authority consulted stressed that a president cannot unilaterally proclaim an emergency and send troops against the clear opposition of state governors. That would go beyond debatable executive action and violate the core federalism principles written into the Constitution. At 3:47 a.m., the four generals held their call. The classified summary sources reviewed shows they examined what one termed their Article 92 duties under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, the rule that requires disobeying unlawful orders. The conversation, carefully described by sources as legal analysis rather than political opinion, focused on whether the directive was a lawful order they disliked on policy grounds, which they must follow, or an unlawful order that violated statute and constitution, which they must refuse. The summary indicates all four commanders independently reached the conclusion that it belonged in the second category. If you are still here and have not subscribed, please do so right now, because what comes next is the single most critical piece of this entire account. At 7:52 this morning, General Caldwell, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, went to the White House for what the public calendar described as a standard national security briefing. The session lasted 17 minutes. Caldwell left immediately, returned to the Pentagon, and at 9:34 a.m. called an emergency meeting with the service chiefs. Someone in a nearby office reported hearing raised voices behind closed doors and the phrase "constitutional oath" repeated several times. At 11:16 a.m., the Secretary of Defense issued a brief two-sentence statement saying all deployment orders must receive appropriate legal review and coordination with the relevant state authorities. It named neither the president nor any specific order, but anyone familiar with Washington messaging instantly recognized it as what one congressional staffer called a five-alarm constitutional alert. Here is what worries me most, and why this differs from past civil-military strains. Civilian control of the military is a bedrock American principle. Generals cannot pick and choose orders based on whether they agree with the policy. That path leads to military rule. Yet the system also rests on the expectation that civilian leaders will issue orders that stay inside constitutional limits. When those limits are breached, officers face an excruciating dilemma: carry out orders that break their constitutional oath or refuse and risk court-martial for disobedience. The framework is not built to manage a situation in which a president repeatedly sends what senior commanders view as illegal directives and then portrays refusal as betrayal instead of legal duty. And it is getting darker. Two Capitol Hill sources say the White House has started quiet conversations with supportive lawmakers about possible legislation that would revise the Posse Comitatus Act to broaden presidential power for domestic military deployments. One early draft circulating among staff would let the president decide alone when local officials have failed to keep order, eliminating the need for a governor's request or a formal emergency proclamation. Scholars who examine the idea call it fundamentally at odds with federalism and almost certainly unconstitutional even if enacted. But the mere existence of such drafting shows the White House knows the present orders would likely fail legal scrutiny and is attempting to rewrite the rules after the fact to legalize what current law forbids. Hit that like button right now, because engagement tells the algorithm whether this explanation reaches the audience that urgently needs to see it before mainstream coverage smothers the story in palace gossip framing. Let me lay out the three realistic paths forward, because the direction we take next will decide whether American constitutional democracy emerges from this intact. Scenario 1, 40% likelihood. The generals stand firm and the White House yields. Unified resistance from combatant commanders creates an execution impasse. A president cannot force deployment of troops whose leaders will not move them. Confronted with institutional pushback and the real prospect of widespread resignations that would trigger a legitimate national security emergency, the White House quietly pulls the directive, calls it a miscommunication, and shifts focus elsewhere. The system endures, but only just, and a dangerous precedent is set. Presidents can probe constitutional edges and retreat only when resistance becomes overwhelming. Even this best outcome exposes how fragile the guardrails have become. Scenario 2, 35% likelihood. Constitutional crisis triggered by mass resignations. The White House declines to retract the order and instead starts relieving commanders who refuse to comply. General Caldwell resigns in protest. Combatant commanders stand by their refusal and face removal. Service chiefs, who command deep loyalty inside their branches, confront agonizing decisions about backing their combatant leaders or preserving the chain of command. Within 2 days, the U.S. military leadership fractures as senior officers choose between legal duty and their careers. The rupture becomes public. Congress is dragged in. Whether the president has committed impeachable conduct by systematically exceeding constitutional bounds turns unavoidable. This path is a true constitutional crisis without an obvious off-ramp. Scenario 3, 25% likelihood. The White House locates compliant replacements. This is the outcome constitutional experts fear most. When current commanders will not comply, the administration systematically replaces them with officers prepared to carry out the directives without raising legal objections. The new leaders may be less seasoned and enjoy less trust within their commands, but they follow orders. Troops move. Governors push back. Federal units end up in confrontation with state National Guard forces. The fundamental question the founders labored to settle through separation of powers, who controls military power during domestic political conflict, erupts into real-world collision. A 1 in 4 chance still represents a devastating collapse of norms that have blocked such clashes for nearly 250 years. But here is the deeper reason this matters. Beyond this crisis, beyond this president, beyond this single week, the American constitutional order does not run on autopilot. It relies on people in power voluntarily respecting limits, even when they could override them. It depends on military leaders treating their oath to the Constitution seriously enough to hazard their careers when civilian superiors issue unlawful instructions. It depends on institutions preserving their integrity even when immense pressure demands surrender. Right now, we are seeing whether those commitments can withstand sustained attack. If the military command structure splinters under this strain, the damage will outlive any one administration. Future presidents, regardless of party, will learn they can disregard constitutional restraints as long as they replace enough people with loyalists who will not push back. So what can you do? I know many watching feel helpless. First, call your senators and representatives. The Capitol switchboard number is 2102-224-3121. Tell them you know what is unfolding at the Pentagon and you demand immediate congressional oversight. The Senate Armed Services Committee has jurisdiction. Sustained public pressure on its members can force open hearings that prevent these matters from being handled through private promises and silent removals. Second, share this video. I realize it sounds promotional, but mainstream outlets are not covering this adequately. They are fixated on surface-level political theater instead of constitutional danger. The algorithm amplifies engagement, so every share helps get this information to people who must understand what is at stake before the window closes. Third, stay engaged. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications. The next 72 hours could change everything, and I will deliver the first clear analysis before the narrative managers can obscure the facts. Here is what I am monitoring over the coming 48 hours. If General Caldwell appears at tomorrow's scheduled Pentagon press briefing, it hints the situation may be stabilizing through back-channel talks. If the briefing is canceled or the Secretary of Defense steps in instead, it signals serious deterioration. If any combatant commander suddenly announces retirement or medical leave in the next 72 hours, it will be the earliest public indication the White House is beginning to systematically replace non-compliant leaders. And if you notice reports of unexpected troop movements or alert status changes at installations tied to Northern Command, Southern Command, or Indo-Pacific Command, it means execution timelines are advancing despite the legal objections. The stakes are as high as they have ever been. The constitutional issues are as stark as they can be. The outcome remains completely uncertain. This is not a drill. This is not spectacle. This is the test of whether our institutions can still impose basic accountability when someone wielding vast power declares the rules no longer apply. Leave a comment below. Do you believe the generals will hold firm? Or will the White House succeed in finding commanders willing to carry out orders their predecessors deemed illegal? I read every comment. Your views on this moment matter, because what happens next will not be settled only by attorneys and generals. It will be settled by whether the American people insist that constitutional boundaries still have meaning.